Hello and welcome to another episode of the CG Garage. This is episode number 480 featuring Chad Wanstreet, who is a VFX supervisor, and he has been supervising many great episodic work. He's been doing this mostly on the studio side these days, which is also very fascinating to sort of hear the difference of working for a VFX house or working on a studio side. He's worked on many great shows, including Sympathizer, SWAT, The Tick, and much more. So really interesting to hear about that. I really love this episode because Chad and I almost crossed paths many times, it seems like, including his early career over at working at SpeedShape and his connection there in Detroit. I worked at SpeedShape, not exactly at the same time, but very close, and sort of how his career sort of evolved from there. So really cool to see that. He worked at Blur, a bunch of other really great places. So really nice to talk to Chad, and I have a feeling that if he and I worked together, we probably would have gotten along very well. We still do get along. We got along really well on this podcast. Okay, I got a couple of product announcements I want to let you guys know about. This is available at chaos.com. First is our virtual production tool called Project Arena. If you have an LED stage or you have access to an LED stage and you want to know more about Project Arena and how you to get that working, you can go to chaos.com/virtual production and sign up there. If you're interested in Vantage, which is the main tool that is behind Project Arena in terms of real-time ray tracing, there is a big announcement about that too. Virtual Production 2 Update 5 is out. It seems like we just announced Update 4, but Update 5 is already out, and there's several features that have been added to that, including VR support through OpenXR. Yes, you can put a VR headset inside of Vantage. Yay, super excited. We also have added animated vegetations that are happening directly inside of Vantage, also a fascinating addition. And we've added some support in certain shaders, such as rounded corners, and ACCG support. So really cool. We also like to talk about Corona 12 that's been added, and Corona obviously with a great render that we're also very proud of, and it has added support for exporting to Vantage. So yes, if you are in Corona and you want to be able to see your stuff in Vantage, you now have that ability. I guess in a way, you probably can go from Corona to Project Arena as well. I don't know if that actually works yet, but it probably will very soon. So super excited about that. Other big things that have been added to Corona 12 is scattered instance brushes, curved decals, virtual frame buffer 2. So lots of new improvements there, including Corona EXR or CXR files that allow you going straight to editing in your Corona image editor. So lots of stuff again in Corona 12, and make sure and check it out. Just go to chaos.com for that information. And speaking of which, if you want to know more about this in terms of events, just go to chaos.com/events. The event I want to talk to you about is on July 9th, which I believe is the day after this podcast comes out, or maybe the day this podcast comes out. There is going to be a free webinar on Corona 12 and Vantage. So if you guys want to know more about that, just go to chaos.com/events. Before I go into the podcast, I'd like to read an acknowledgement. Chad, as I mentioned, was on the podcast, and I'm super excited to do that. But after we recorded this podcast, he sent me some news, and he asked me if I could read an acknowledgement for him, which I'd be happy to do. So here you go. Chad and the entire Sympathizer team are saddened by the passing of our friend and colleague, Dan Lombardo. Dan was an exceptional friend and a bright beacon on the visual effects team for the show. His loving disposition and kind heart always made even the hardest days enjoyable, and his dedication to the team was infectious. Dan's hilarious stories about the many years in the visual effects industry will be missed, and we will all proudly cherish working with him. So thanks very much for sharing that with us, and we're very sorry for everyone's loss. Please enjoy episode number 480.
Welcome to another CG Garage, where the Chaos Group talks. You'll know it's over when the last bucket drops. We're gonna fire off rays in high dynamic range. We know that ambient occlusion is passé. Global illumination won't lead you astray. And while image-based lighting is really swell, You need to make sure everything has for now.
All right, Chad, thank you so much, man. It's been awesome to be able to connect with you, and I'm excited to hear about your background and know more about what's happening in your life. Obviously, the world of visual effects right now is changing quite a bit, and there's a lot of changes, exciting changes, different changes, and I'd like to sort of hear your thoughts on all that. But let's start with your background. Where did you get into CG? Like, how did you get interested in computer graphics?
So architecture.
Oh, same as me. Nice.
Yeah. So you and I have been like circling the same group of people for a long time. Like Lyndon Bernard is a very close friend of mine, right?
Nice.
So he and I grew up together.
In Michigan.
Actually,
okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah, right across the street from each other.
Wow, there you go.
We got in a lot of trouble together. But if I were to say how I got into CG, it would be Lyndon first, and then architecture. Lyndon was my like secret weapon in architecture school, and how I started using like V-Ray and everything, because like he was on V-Ray free or whatever at the time at SpeedShape, and I was in architecture school like doing all of these like visualizations and all this stuff, and then I also started freelancing and early days of ArcViz.
Where were you going to were you going to architecture school in Michigan as well, or?
So no, I went to school for music percussion performance in Michigan, and then in Ithaca as well for graduate studies. And then I wound up at a small school in New Hampshire called Keene State, where I started architecture, and then went to UMass Amherst for graduate studies. And I only did 1 year there, and then like I just got busy and started doing other stuff. So
did you ever practice architecture? Okay.
No, because everybody, like, I was doing all these fancy renderings and everything, and everybody was like super excited to have me participate on that. And it was way more fun because I was in the design stage of everything, and all my friends were like draft monkeys, and I was doing all this fun stuff. I was like, well, this is way better.
I know exactly where you are because I was doing the same thing. I remember at one point, people like I had my internship over at a company called Fox and Fowl, and all the other interns were like cutting.
I know Fox and Fowl, of course.
And they were cutting foam core and stuff, and I was creating these massive animations, and they're like, "How is he having all the fun?" It's like, well, I learned this.
Yeah. So oddly enough, one of my good friends was like one of the partners there at Fox and Fowl for many years, and one of the people that was teaching me, Donna.
Oh
Paley.
my God! Okay,
Donna Paley.
Yeah.
So she was there for a while, and then wound up in New Hampshire, and so
I was when I was there that summer is when they were building like their biggest project to date, which was a number 4 Times Square building, that giant building with a big curved. That's what they're building there, and I was working on a small building called the American Bible Society, and we had the same foam core model, and it was funny because we realized that our entire building could fit inside the lobby at the same scale of the other building.
Nice.
So that's cool. Sorry, I digress. I was a little reminiscing. Okay, so you were doing visual effects back in those days, or doing ArcViz, I guess. Yeah.
ArcViz. And then we had our first kid, and it was 2008. So like the economy tanked, and architecture, was in the dumps when the economy tanks. So Lyndon and I were talking, and he was like, "Come work at SpeedShape. It'll be great. We're expanding. Everything's great at SpeedShape." So I went to work at SpeedShape.
Nice. Okay, so that I guess that 2008, that was a little bit after I left, right? I left there. Right.
It was. You had left, I think, like a month or two prior to me arriving. It was definitely like post Chris. Chris is gone. No.
Okay. But so were you doing automobile stuff, I guess, at that point? Yeah.
Yeah. So when I started, it was like still like the GM configurator days, and they lost that contract in like the first month or two that I was there.
Okay.
And then they like laid off a bunch of people. And, Lyndon, when we had talked originally, and this is, if I'm giving away too much, I don't think so. But it was like, we're going to expand to Boston. And I wanted to go back to Boston. So it's like, oh, well, sweet. Like, yeah, I want to go back. So we start, and they laid off like 30 people. And I go in, I'm like, dude, what's happening? And it's like, oh, no, they're just trimming the fat. They're trimming the fat. And like, Sure. So another 3 months goes by, another 30 people get laid off. And then my wife goes in for labor. And while I'm gone, Lyndon's like, dude, when can you get back? Like, if you know, they're going to lay off more. Like, I'm gone. Like, I'm having a kid. So I came back, still had my job, and there were 10 of us left at that point.
The LA office, I guess, at this point was closed, right?
Well, it was, so we were still occupying that same, the LA office was still open. But it was just like barely humming along, you know.
Was the Blackbird project
Marco
done at this point?
Blackbird was done by this point. Yeah. Like Blackbird.
Just to give people perspective, Blackbird people in this process. Blackbird project was this spec project that was run under Rob Niederhorst, and Rob Niederhorst was part of SpeedShape at that time, and so it was this big project that was actually kind of a big deal because the director of Blackbird was actually who else? Joe Kaczynski. And it was Joe had sort of not done needed to get into doing big car commercials, and that was his first one that he had done under his relationship with Rob Niederhorst. Got that, and because of the Blackbird project, he got a bunch of other car commercials that he did over at Digital Domain, and because of those commercials at Digital Domain, that landed him Tron.
Well, first Gears of War,
though, that's true. Yes.
Yeah, because that was like one of the most epic video game trailers
for sure,
right?
But like, Blackbird was the one that sort of got his feet off the ground,
kicked it.
Yeah,
and it was beautiful.
Oh, it was gorgeous.
It was so gorgeous.
There's no question of no question of Joe's capability of commercial. He actually did a really beautiful commercial that no one saw before that over at Sway, which was a clove cigarette commercial for Indonesia. It was gorgeous.
Huh. I have no doubt.
I don't think most people know that or have ever seen it. Yeah. Anyway, so you're still part of this thing. This company is kind of like, you don't know where it's going. You're a new father. You're probably a little worried about your benefits, right?
It was definitely stressful. And we went down to like the 10 people, you know, like Jared, Mike Ward, Roger Pruden, Lyndon, and Dave Gray, right? And we just started doing tons of work. That's when they started doing like animations and all these other things. So it was like, and we were diversifying big time. It was no longer configurators and, you know, because that work was largely gone. It was like Ford. We were doing those Mustang commercials and some things here and there for Camaros and whatever. So we got into more like true visual effects as opposed to just like technical art pieces, you know, for automotive, and doing more like simulations and fume effects and Houdini and all of that stuff. So in doing that, I wound up doing a brief stint at RTT.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right. As all people in Michigan, I think, do. And then Pluto. Do you know those guys? Dave Corbett and Tim. Shoot. I can't remember. I can't believe I'm forgetting Tim's last name. Anyway, they were a little studio. They were like a little post place doing a lot of motion graphics and stuff. And they got it in their mind that they wanted to diversify into CG. So James Vicor, myself, and John Akira went over and started a little thing. And Lyndon would freelance with us, all this stuff. But we were doing a bunch of like commercials and car configurators and little kind of specky stuff. But at that point, I got in contact, or Blur got in contact with me while I was working there, and that's how I wound up coming out to LA.
Blur.
They hit me up about a job.
Okay.
And I wound up here.
So Blur, because I know I've actually have a story about applying to Blur and how to get. It's hard to get a job at Blur, right? It's almost like Tim has to personally find you and like say, this guy's good, you know.
It was interesting because I didn't apply. Like, I never reached out to them.
They actually find you sometimes, right?
Well, a friend of mine had applied. Daryl Johnson. I think you know him, right? So he had applied, and I wrote a recommendation for him. And then, what's her name? Monica. just responded like, that was a really nice recommendation. Thanks so much. You were, very quick to do it. I'm like, okay, cool. Like a month later, I get an email from Monica. Hey, by the way, we looked at your stuff. Do you want a job? Like, what?
Amazing. Yeah.
and it's like, could you cut a more recent reel? I'm like, yeah, I guess. Sure. So I cut another reel, and then they're like, yes, we're definitely interested. And then they flew me out. I met Tim, met with Monica, met with Keith, all those guys. And that's that. And then I was selling my house in Michigan and on a plane like a couple months later.
So what year was that about?
That was 2014. Okay. So I started on Groundhog, which was Halo. Well, actually, I started on Batman Arkham Knight at my house in Michigan. Right. Working in my basement from like 1 o'clock in the morning till 8
Was Kevin Margot working on that? Was he the soup on? Yeah.
Yeah, Margot was on that. Yeah. So he was my supervisor. Supervisor on that, and then I wound up on Spider-Man again while I was in Michigan. Because like in the interim before I moved out, they like started just like throwing me all this random work. So I was working on the Spider-Man movie and then doing like assets and stuff like that on Batman. But yeah, Margot and then David Stinick was on the Spider-Man movie. Right. And so when I came out, I was still finishing up the Spider-Man movie, and I was doing everything in Nuke. And as we know, they were a Fusion studio.
One of the last ones.
So,
I mean, I'm sure they had, this must be a problem, like, because no one knows Fusion except for Blur people at that point, right? Yeah.
Pretty much. Yeah. It comes in really handy nowadays with Resolve, where you're like, oh yeah, I can string all this together. But I wound up coming out, and I remember Keith shipped my desktop out like directly to Blur from our house. And we moved here. We got here, and we were still moving in, and I was starting at Blur. My wife's at home, and we had twin 6-month-olds at that point. I have 4 kids, so those were the last 2. So my poor wife is at home. Keith was sending her flowers like daily, like apologizing. And my first day there, I think, was like a 16-hour day or something like that. Day 1, right? Like true Blur fashion. Yep. So, and that was setting up, like getting Nuke running with Jeff, who was their like head of IT and everything, or not IT, but software and everything.
And were you coming in as a generalist or as a compositor, or was
it was like scene assembly generalist with the with the thoughts of CG supervision and other things. How
one company that sort of operates outside of the norm, it's Blur. Like all their titles are different, and they've always been like that from day one.
Yes.
So yeah.
So it was a very weird like mixed bag of things. So I wound up doing like scene assembly and effects and a bunch of random stuff there in my time there. We did a tree, this big thing in Oprah's new office at one point. There was a whole bunch of crazy things. But
yeah.
So yeah, I worked there for almost 2 years. And then had a stint at Encore. And then went to Fuze FX and was for their
How long were you at Fuze FX?
3.5 years, I want to say, just over 3 years.
And this was over in Sherman Oaks area, kind of.
Yeah. Well, first we were in the little Burbank office, right? And it was funny too because I remember Dave Altano at the time interviewed me, and Matt Von Brock, who was also there, had interviewed me, and Altano interviews me, and he's walking me around, and he's like, our place isn't anything like glamorous or whatever. I was like, dude, I appreciate that. Like, I've worked at the glamorous places. Right. And, the priorities are clear. You obviously have different priorities here. And I appreciate
when you see the money going into the furniture, you get a little worried,
Yes, exactly. That comment can be made in some other places.
Yep.
So, but then we moved to the very nice fancy place.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm not going to name the studio, but I was at a studio meeting at one point, and we were working with a director who was very insightful. Let's just put it this way. Right. And we had a meeting, and I go into the conference room, and like there was all new furniture in the conference room, and he looks at me and goes, "Is this new furniture?" And I said, "Oh yeah, it is. It's nice." And he goes, didn't you guys just have some layoffs not long ago? Why are you buying new furniture? And it's like, wow, when they noticed that, it's like, no, I can sit in the shitty chair if you keep your artists,
Yeah. Well, the funny thing too is everybody notices it. You get a lot of comments from clients. That's the one thing I've
Where
always
are your dollars going
is
to,
like,
right?
They look at the tile floor, the Italian marble, like all these things, like lots of comments on.
And it's
like,
not a good thing to look like you spend
No.
money on the wrong places. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because they know how low your profit margins are.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so actually, in that Burbank, I might have visited you guys in that little studio at some point. Like, I might have been there, with Vlado.
Yeah, we were like split in like 3 different spaces.
It almost looked like little houses, right? It was like,
Yeah, there was the overheating ice cream shop. There was then the above the house or whatever. Right. Like, it was all over the place.
But then you got a nice, proper studio spot in Sherman Oaks, which was great.
Yeah. That was a great building. It was good for a lot, like just the expansion of everything. I mean, obviously they were at that point blowing up. We just had like so much work.
And crazy. Mitch was there, I think, right? Yeah,
of course. Yeah. Mitch Gates and so many
yeah. Okay, awesome. I can't believe we haven't really connected since then. We know all this.
No, it's wild too, because like Art is a good friend of mine,
or Art Cyan?
Nadell is a good friend of mine. Like Nadell is like my best friend, right? So like
nice.
So it's always like Chris, but like we've never
And Nadell, I was at Fuse, and I was on the list. Remember back in the old days when you had to be on the wait list for a Model 3 Tesla, right? And I had been on the list for like a couple of years, and everyone who had one was on the list. And Nadell got his before anyone, like very early. And he's like, all right, you want to? I was like, I've never actually sat in one. And so I was sat in his. We drove it around for a while in the Fuse parking lot.
Yes.
It's kind of funny. Awesome. Okay. Well, this is cool. So what were some of the big projects you were working on back then? Like you mentioned the stuff at Blur, but what were stuff you were doing at Fuse and at Encore and stuff?
So Fuse, I wound up on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. for a little bit. I did a year. I think like everybody has to. I was a CG supervisor. I came in as a CG soup there, and did the Ghost Rider.
Oh, okay.
Season, right. So, and like I do a lot of fire. That's one of like the things I really enjoy. So we did that, and then I wound up starting to like VFX Soup some other shows, and I got The Tick.
Oh, nice.
Was the my first show, like big show out. And it wound up, it wasn't supposed to be what it became, which was this just like monster of a show. And it just grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. So we did season 1 of that with Ben Edlund, who was amazing. And I wound up working with Nick Bradley on that, who is the post supervisor on SWAT that I work on, and Night Agent and all sorts of stuff. Timeless, that I eventually wound up working on with Stephen Fleet. So I met him working on season 1, and then he went off and had to do, I forget what he was working on at the time, but he had a bunch of stuff he was working on, so he couldn't do Tick season 2. And Cindy Kerber came in and was working on Tick season 2 before she took the job at Sony. So I'd worked with both of them in these this VFX supervisor position, and there was no client-side VFX supervisor, so I kind of filled that gap for them while I was working at Fuse. And Cindy would always tell me, like, you need to come client-side, you need to come and work for us, work for the dark side, work for the dark side. I'm like, yeah, sure. Like, I need a job. I need a show to do that.
What is that like? Why? And first of all, why did they say work for the dark side? Like, why is it the dark side?
She's just joking.
Understand, but there is an implication, though, right? So,
yeah, I mean, I think that it's the smaller rebellion, right? Like, which isn't the dark side necessarily, but like the client, you're the bad guy. So I think that's really the dark side per se. Sure. But so I met her, and I'd worked on Timeless with Nick and some other stuff. And I wound up going to Zoic shortly after Fuze FX sold to, let me say this right, Eagle Tree.
Yep.
Sorry. So they did their whole VC thing. I wound up leaving. And when I started at Zoic, I told them, like, hey, like, I want to go client side. I'll probably end up going, with Nick Bradley or Cindy Kerber or something. But, that's down the road. I wound up in New Zealand on Sweet Tooth, working on the pilot for that. And I get a text message from Cindy Kerber. And she says, Chad, why the fuck aren't you working for me? And this is a text message. And I just respond, are you offering me a job?
Right. Just because you never offered one. Right.
Yeah. And she's like, where are you in the world? And I'm like, I'm in New Zealand right now. It's like, when are you back? I'm like, in like 3 weeks or something. So she's like, well, I want to talk with you when you're back. So fast forward, they wound up hiring me on SWAT to replace Victor Scalisi, who had left to work on Away over at Netflix and has done, what was the One Piece. He's the supervisor on One Piece. And Jason Sperling had been on the show previously. So it was like Jason, then Victor, then me. And I've been on it since season 3. So I started working on that with Nick and Cindy, who now works as an overlord. And that's kind of how I transitioned into this. So yeah.
So what is the difference? Like, how would you say the difference is from being a supervisor at Zoic to being a supervisor at at the studio side?
I mean, obviously, it's a lot more focused, right? Like when you're a supervisor at a facility, they might have you on 5 different jobs and you're splitting all over the place and doing all these crazy things. You're not actually like truly wearing the supervisor hat. It's like you've got the facility and facility management and personnel. Like once you move into the production side supervisor role, you have your team, and our teams are much smaller. So like interpersonal drama is not a thing that you really have to deal with on a daily basis anymore. There might be, of your 5 or however many people you've got working with you on any given day, a little issue, but it's not the majority.
But you're not dealing with
of your time
pipeline
anymore.
And how big your storage space is.
Yeah, exactly. Just all of that stuff, all of your render woes, all of that stuff goes away, and it's just way more hyper focused on what's the story, the directors, their needs.
Yep.
The production's needs, all of these things become your day-to-day as opposed to all of those other things that you actually don't want to have as your day-to-day.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, some people like working on facility. Some people like the that low, but I get what you're saying. Yeah.
I mean, truly, I think a lot of people really enjoy it. And there's the diversity of work, which is great. Like you jump from this project to that project to that project, and there's always something, different. I think the one nice thing about the team that I've wound up with is they've put me in rooms with all sorts of other people that wasn't really anticipated when I started on SWAT, right? Like Paul, who's one of the UPM or was the UPM, and Jim, they started coming to me with scripts in season 4. Like, Chad, look at this, look at this, look at this. And I started doing all these breakdowns for like Village Roadshow and stuff. And one of them hits me, and it's called Kill the Orange Faced Bear. And I read the script, and I went back to them, I'm like, guys, this is the craziest fucking script I've ever read in my life.
Is that the name of the script, or is that... Yeah. Okay.
It was, it is the name of the script. So, and they're like, well, you're going to talk to the showrunner tomorrow. We're organizing a call, and you're going to talk to them tomorrow. So I'm like, what? Oh, okay. So I put together a pitch deck, all this stuff. They're like, they want to know, what this is going to take.
Okay.
So I get on the call. So just to frame it for you, it is and we did a pilot. The pilot got picked up, and we started the series, and then it got canceled, right? So, but at that point, what became known to me was that it was a half-hour comedy involving CG VFX talking bears photoreal talking bears voiced by Will Ferrell, Sarah Silverman, among others,
Sure.
right? So, and that talent was already like, they were signed. They were like, basically good
Sure.
to go. So, and then Damon Wayans Jr. was the like live action component, and they were going to interact. There's a whole like vengeance story. It was absolutely nuts. The bears have sex. They do.
This seems like
all sorts
someone
of
saw
wild
Cocaine Bear and
things.
they say, how do we turn this into a series?
So this was before
Okay.
Cocaine Bear. And we wound up shopping kind of at the same time. And like D-Neg was bidding on Cocaine Bear and Kill the Orange Face Bear. I can tell you, Cocaine Bear's got nothing on Kill the Orange Face
Oh,
Bear.
I'm sure.
Like,
Right. Yeah.
nothing.
Cocaine Bear's pretty low budget.
It was. Well, no, not even that, but just like from a subject
sure.
matter
Yeah, right.
standpoint,
Yeah.
like the things that we were going to do were just absolutely nuts, and what we were setting up was absolutely insane. So D-Neg wound up working on the pilot, and that got picked up. And all of this was through like the SWAT guys. They just like put me in this room. They're like, Chad, meet these guys. And I'm like,
Sure.
okay. And that, started, and they've always been great. They're like, yeah, go do that you have fun. And I can kind of manage both things, and they allow me to do that, which
Awesome.
is great.
So what is it like? I mean, when you're working on the studio side, do they keep you at the studio and they just throw you new projects that they're working on, and they try to get you sort of look at the bigger picture?
Paul and Jim will like to do that, because they've got a lot of stuff coming through. A lot of times I generally try to just like fly below the radar and just do like whatever it is that I'm doing and just stay focused on that. I have people that I like to work with, and that's always been more important to me, is like the relationships and the people as opposed to the project. And like SWAT's a really great one. The Sympathizer, right, which I'm just coming off of, that was another one which like the team there was amazing. And like Ron and Karen, the UPM and line producer, they were awesome. Janet Muswell was awesome to work with. So like that group is another group where I'm like, yeah, I want to work with those people, because they're just pleasant and nice, and obviously, have a high bar expectation, which is also, where I enjoy being.
Sure. Well, that's awesome. Okay. Well, that sounds like you found a pretty good place for yourself after all this. Yeah.
Hopefully. Yeah. I mean, that's.
Is that what when you go back, let's go back to like you like talking to Lyndon and doing architect. Did you ever imagine you being here or?
No. I mean, that's one of the things, like I was talking with somebody recently, and they were asking me about like my trajectory or whatever. And like, I had no idea what a VFX Supervisor was, when I started this. Like there was never a like, I want to be that, right?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, is it just
no.
because you were doing architecture that Lyndon was like, oh, you got to try this CG stuff? Is that really what got you into it, or?
I mean, I started doing the CG stuff like while doing architecture, because I had seen what he had done, right? And like the cars and some of the other stuff he was doing. I was like, well, I could do that. So I started messing with it. And architecture school is absolutely grueling. Yes. And music school is also absolutely grueling. So Lyndon was basically like, Chad can do that. He can do this. And so they put me in a room and was like, go.
Right.
I was like, all right, sure. And there was definitely like a learning curve for sure, especially on like the automotive stuff. That was my first month or two was like, okay. But it just becomes like second nature, and you're placing the lights and doing all the stuff and it pretty quickly.
So what, I mean, obviously, episodic you were coming into it in 2013, 2014, stuff like that. And so it has changed drastically over the years. The expectations, what's made out of it, it used to be, CG was like, questionable in every shot. And now it's like, has to be at least on par with some of the best. So how has that transition been of like expecting quality over years?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because even on a show, like we can look at it in the context of like when we were at Fuze, when I started there, streaming was just really like getting its legs, right? And like some of the big spectacles, and obviously House of Dragons was out already, but they were or not House of Dragons, Game of Thrones. I have House of Dragons in my head because I watched it last night. Game of Thrones was really getting its legs on like full,
and they're like, oh my god, people are doing like full feature stuff on a TV show.
Yeah. And there was still like working on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., there was a high bar. You know, Mark Kolpak really has a high expectation, and anything Marvel at that point, there was a really high bar. So that was where we started to see the like week by week really trying to like notch it up again and again and again, but doing it on a network level versus trying to compete against the streamers was definitely difficult and is always difficult. But I think that now like we have the tool sets that are just even amplifying, making that difference even less so, right? Like I'm seeing my teams that were working on the Sympathizer where we had months to work on an explosion, do an equivalent explosion on SWAT in a couple of weeks at the same quality level.
Sure.
Right? Like it's actually really impressive what these guys are starting to pull off. And like Ingenuity is who I go to for all of my like fire and everything.
Big Houdini place.
It's impressive. Big Houdini place. Yep. But like, you know, Grant's great because he's there. Like
I know Grant Miller. He's been on the podcast.
Okay, you know Grant. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. So Grant's great because, and one of the things I think he and I really get along about is that he's not like agnostic in any one thing. As far as software or anything, like he's not the guy that like digs his heels in and this is the way we do it and we're going to do it this way. If something looks better, Grant will change and spin their pipeline around like 360, 180, you know, whatever it takes in a heartbeat to like make sure that they're innovating. And I think that's one of the things that I've really always appreciated about him, and I've always appreciated about their studio.
Yeah. What about your transition, you know, into things during the pandemic? Obviously there was a lot of stuff going on there. The demand for episodic was way higher, right? And then suddenly everyone wants virtual production. Like what, how did you sort of manage all of those expectations?
I mean, it was, so the whole COVID thing was really weird. We wound up, SWAT was one of the last shows shooting during when like everybody went down, right? So we actually wound up doing an air-to-air unit, and I was in a little plane and we had a helicopter, and like that's one of the fun things about this show is we have all of the toys, like feature level, all the toys, helicopters, planes, you know, you name it, like the best driving rigs, all this stuff. So we were the last show to shoot, and then I think one of the first shows to pick back up. So during like the whole COVID thing, we were only down for like a month and a half, right? And then we were right back up, right? Especially because we were finishing stuff up in post. I think the most stressful thing about that time was like you didn't know if studios were gonna last and how they were transitioning and if they were going remote and all these things, right? So that occurred, and then that's about when Kill the Orange Faced Bear also wound up in my lap. So I wound up working on that project for about 2.5 years. And that was, there wasn't a lot of asks about some of these things that were transitioning. Crowds, obviously, we were doing a ton of that because of COVID and everything. But virtual production really, I wound up on a show called Dollface. And Disney was really trying to push their setup at that point. There was an agenda to try to get people to do virtual production. Still really early days. And
was Disney in terms of the ILM Mandalorian stuff that was going on? Is that what you're...
Yes, but they were trying to build their own stage, and they were setting up, they had like a relationship with, who was it? The guys out of Sun Valley. Oh my God, why can't I forget?
Was it
can't
Lux?
believe I'm forgetting their name.
Not Lux.
Not Lux.
Okay.
Oh, I'll remember it the second this podcast ends. So they were kind of pushing it and really wanted us to use it, but I was pushing very anti-no on it.
What was your reason for not wanting it? What was your concerns?
I think there was, and there still is, a serious lack of understanding about like what you can do and can't do. And because of that, a lot of wasted time and money. It's very expensive. Obviously, we all know that, to go in and do it. And if you're not prepped properly and you your DP and you aren't in alignment on what needs to happen and what can happen, that there are serious cost implications to that unfortunately cannot be undone.
That's okay. Good that you brought that up. I mean, during the pandemic, there was this, this is going to save our ass, right? And they didn't know why, right? They're like, we don't have to travel, so therefore we can shoot in a stage, and that's how it's going to be. And I remember actually Lou Pecora was telling me at one point, I think he was in Zoic, and he was like, people were like, let's just Mandalorian it. And I'm like,
yes, let's just Mandalorian
and I'm like,
it. Yes.
What does that mean? You know? It's like, we'll just use the power of nanotechnology. Like, what?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, people not understanding, like, because at that point, nobody was really doing like the 2 camera setups where you're oscillating, your shutter speed and all that stuff. So, I remember we had somebody show up and like they brought a second camera body, and we were supposed to be doing a projected Unreal scene, and like, no, you can't shoot that, and like really trying to explain like, no, this isn't going to work. You can't bring that. You can't fly in a second camera body while we're projecting. Like, look at what you're going to capture. Like, this is useless. But there was a serious like lack of understanding and lack of knowledge about all these things, and even like getting the camera too close or all of these things. So we had issues with that, and I know even like there's another really big show that was shooting on the volume, and like recently that was having massive issues with all the same stuff, like not understanding how to get 2 bodies working, like all of these different things, and it's still even on that show very debatable whether or not it actually saved them any money, and they actually think it cost them a whole lot more money than it was really worth. So I mean, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for it, and I know like Nadell was actually over at Torchlight recently talking with Alex Cannon and Alex Locasel. This is my plug for those guys. Alex, you owe me. No. Get a 50% discount next time you go to Torchlight. But they're setting up some cool stuff, and it's all very like visionary and like a sandbox, basically. And I think that obviously there's a lot to be said for it, and virtual production and everything in that capacity, like in a sandbox and just like exploring different ideas. But I'm still very reluctant. Like,
I got to tell you about
what we're
doing with Project Arena. I don't know if you know about Project Arena or not.
No, I don't.
Okay. Yeah, it's a long story, but I'm not going to bore people in the podcast. But I will explain it to you, and I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on that, because I think that you're right. I think there's a lot of expectations and stuff, but they're stuck in this. The problem is you're stuck in this process and this loop, and a pipeline that is not necessarily a VFX friendly pipeline, or even a production friendly pipeline. So
correct. Well, or a pipeline that is thinking about VFX in that capacity, right? Like they're used to production designer is the first person you bring on. Right, and casting, and as opposed to what's changing, and we're seeing it change, is production design and VFX are some of the first people that are being brought on, especially for these big shows where we're actually having to plan, and there is the potential of you might want to shoot on a volume, and we might need to get assets ready, but if you aren't starting it from that runway, then right out of the gate, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I was curious about where you are on that, because obviously from the studio side of things, I think that there's a reality, right? People are sometimes going, what's going on? And then it's the reality of it. Well, what about what
they want to do it a lot. There's a lot of talk that, it's always, what if we did this? And they don't like hearing it.
Yeah. I think, I don't know, but and this is coming from someone that makes technology and wants, my company sells technology, right? But at the same time, I feel like if it's not servicing the production, it doesn't make any sense, right? If you put technology ahead of what you're actually trying to accomplish, that's not the right attitude, because virtual production is actually not new technology. I mean, this is essentially rear projection, but freaking Hitchcock was using it, right? And so the only thing that's changing is that you can move your camera around a little bit better, and you can do a lot of things, and that does open the door to a lot of interesting ideas, and it does enable a lot of stuff in terms of what your environments are, and it makes rear projection a much more viable solution. But at the same time, if you think you're just going to do everything in camera, that's not true.
No, it's all a myth. I mean, it's unfortunate too, because it's very similar to no VFX was used or no CGI was used in the filming of this movie, and we did everything on the volume. Those two things are like, I think, the two biggest lies that exist that encompass VFX.
Why do you think that's the new, especially now? I mean, we've had several episodes where we've had people talk about this, like how CG has been villainized by Hollywood, especially anyone that's in the marketing side of things, right? So why do you how do you manage that?
I mean, it's difficult. You've got a lot of people that look. You can't really point a finger at any one person or any one studio and say it's their fault necessarily. But I think that there's a technological reach that Marvel is always making, which is good, and it has benefits in R&D and all the studios that all of us use to do photoreal VFX, in de-aging and face replacements and all these fun crazy things. But in that reach becomes a lack of reality, unfortunately, and that lack of reality, then I think all these directors are looking at Marvel and it's like, oh, it's not real, and it's all of these terrible things, right? Whatever they want to say about it. Plenty of directors have said lots of mean things about Marvel. But that reach is needed in order for all of us to benefit from that the technological leaps that are happening there, that help to make some of the other more standard VFX more real and whatnot. So I just personally think that, that's unfortunately a Marvel vilification.
Well, I think that
and
yes and no, right? Because yes, Marvel is being villainized in some ways, but then they're like, oh, the reason Marvel stuff sucks is not because Marvel stories suck, it's because VFX, which is the wrong...
Right, which is the wrong way to look at it.
Your scripts probably need some ideas.
I wasn't going to say that.
And ironically, that's the cheapest thing to fix. You start with a good script and you can do a lot better work.
Good story. It's amazing. It really goes a long way.
And you can forgive a lot of really bad VFX if you have a really great script.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's there's so many great movies from the 80s and 90s that have not good VFX.
Terminator?
And they were really... Well, that, I mean...
I love Terminator. And Stan Winston was doing great work. But if you look at the Stan Winston stuff and him tearing his face apart, I was like, ooh, really?
Yeah. Well, even Nightmare on Elm Street.
But those are great, stuff. Right? And those are fun, etc. But, why is it that suddenly those are great because they're quote unquote practical, but they don't really...
Right.
I mean, if you're going to compare, they look great because they have that feeling of that works with the thing that you're looking at, right? It's the same thing with Poor Things, right? Poor Things is very bizarre visual effects, not necessarily the greatest thing, but the whole thing works, right? Because they've got a story that sort of makes it all work.
Yeah, that supports it.
Yeah.
And it's a visual consistency of language. I think that's the other thing that unfortunately, when you parse out to 36 different studios, all of these different things, it's hard to maintain consistency across your, visual language.
I mean, that's part
right?
of your job, though, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. That's my job. But I can't imagine, that's one of the reasons why we break things up in the way that, makes sense for us and we can maintain visual continuity.
Is that your hardest job?
But
is to try to find that?
That is one of the things, is casting it. Yeah. I think like making the pick of who you really think can do this and who's going to be the best person for it. Because, obviously, like, certain people are really great. Certain studios are really great at certain things. And it's always the balancing of the money and the quality, and that, like, ever changing. Do you hit it with a hammer and try to go with ILM, or, you use somebody a little bit more nimble and potentially that can also punch above their weight belt, or their weight.
And you don't always get. I mean, I'm not bashing ILM, but I'm just saying sometimes you go to the expensive place and you don't always get what you think you're going to get. Right? You're like, oh, we spent a lot of money on this, and I could have done it with these guys I know in Argentina, and they're going to, or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately,
it's a risk reward thing, right?
It's a risk reward thing, and it's also, obviously, like, your priorities and their priorities need to be in alignment. And if you're coming with the right director and you're coming with the right show and studio, you probably have an alignment. If you're not, then it is hard for you to be like the priority at a place like that, and to know that you're going to be a priority, at least not the priority, of course. Whereas you can go to, somewhere in Poland or Argentina or, some of these other places in the world that have some great talent.
Definitely. Poland is a good one. That's a great example. There's some really amazing.
Yes, Poland is one of my favorites.
They've got some amazing visual effects artists there, very under the radar. So definitely some bargains.
Yes, they are one of those, like, I think they'd punch way above their weight, and, like, quality for money, like, definitely above bar.
The biggest problem I always have when I'm working with places like that is actually time zone feedback problems.
I mean, you get used to it. When
it gets closer to the deadline, it's harder. It's tough when it's close to the deadline.
I guess I've been doing it for a long time. Like, I've got a long-standing relationship with Yannick's, and they've been on every show of mine. Like, we pre-track everything on our shows. And because of that, we're always, like, on this split time zone. Like, it's just kind of, obviously I've got a shorthand with them. Whereas somebody like Platige, as you get up closer to delivering and stuff, it gets a little bit more stressful on our side, especially when you've got your vendors here in the States and then your vendors elsewhere. But I think generally they're great at accommodating and working in our time zones when they need
How obviously we've had a bunch of strikes recently and a lot of turmoil in Hollywood. How is it that on the studio side, how have they responded? Because a lot of the questions about this is how technology is going to change filmmaking, right? Specifically AI tools. Are they looking at places like talking to people like you and like, how is this going to, what is it, should we use this or not use it? Like, how do you manage that?
Yeah. There are a lot of people out there pushing AI tools in different capacities, and a lot of the VFX executives are looking at it and asking us to look and vet, these studios and try them out, see, whether or not it's just BS or not, which, a lot of it is. I think, like, that's is that your thing? Is like real, not real? Like is that Yeah, I mean, it really is. Like, even just when you're vetting the studio, like, I'll get sent pages and, like, this studio or that studio, and they're like, look at these people. Would you use them? They want to, like, offer their services or whatever. And there's a lot of, like, no. No.
Right. And is it mainly because you know that what they're promising they can't deliver, or is it because you don't trust what they're doing?
I think there's a twofold. So obviously from the studios, your data, where your data is from, is super important, right? And that's the most number one copyright, right? So we're definitely looking at that.
How do you vet that?
That's a really tough thing to vet. And if you're not saying where your data is coming from right out of the gate, to me, you're a no.
Right.
Like, it's, and that is one of those things, like, you should be able to say, this is where our data comes
internet.
from. This is, well, yeah, and if it's the internet, that's bad. Because that is, I can tell you, like, I've been talking with one of the studios, and there's a real fear that, like, any use of AI is somehow going to be this, like, thing that's going to take over and Terminator at the studio, and they've got all copyright issues and all these things, and it's generatively creating things that it's not supposed to, right? Which obviously we know that that's not going the way it's going to happen, or what is happening and how people are using these tools. Machine learning and AI, there's a distinct and generative AI, right? I think that's the other thing, is like there's a real lack of understanding between like different AI and machine learning and what the different models can do and all the, so on and so forth. So there's definitely fear at the studios of like VFX studios using AI. I think they're watching to see if there's like investments or opportunities in tools for real, like not just these made up things like we're gonna fix everything, miraculously and generate your VFX amazingly. But they're watching. I think it's like cautious observence and cautious optimism as opposed to like them just jumping in full in.
Do you see, I mean, we've heard rumors, and you don't have to answer this, of places like, oh no, they're just hiring entire departments of prompt engineers that are just making all the concept art in AI, and it's just completely bypassing all of the way that they traditionally do things with concept artists, et cetera. Do you feel that's true, or is that mostly just a paranoia thing that's happening?
I know, like, firsthand that a number of the studios ban their concept artists from using any generative AI. Like the big ones. I'm not going to name the names, but the big ones. I have close friends, I can tell you firsthand, they are not allowed to use any AI. They're not allowed to play with it. They're not allowed to experiment with it at home, like have it on their machines, any of it.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense because I understand that there's a concept of at the same time, when I was in studios, before any of this was happening, and people were coming up with ideas of films, they were pulling up all kinds of images off the internet and posting up on their wall, which is even more directly using it.
Yeah, I think that a lot of what we use AI for in something like Midjourney, and when I say we, like even myself, right? It's like the Google image search now. Instead of Googling something, I prompt it and flash through variations and all these things. And in that way, look, I mean, we've used Midjourney to prompt and show some visuals to a director, and then take that and give it to the concept painter. Okay, this was the thing that they liked. Go and now actually make it cool, right? And good. And like,
which isn't different from they like the idea of this thing from Maleficent, so do something along the lines of that.
Exactly. Yes, we could show them a picture from Maleficent or whatever it is, and it's the same thing, but in this way you're guiding it in like tone, color, like all these things, which you can actually put in the subject matter. And
but the concept artists themselves, they need to create something original without any of those things.
Yes. Yeah, and we're not foregoing the step of exploration of going to concept artists. But what we are expediting is the talk between me and the director, and then what the concept artist gets, as opposed to, well, it might be this, or it might be that, or it might be this or that. And instead of spending X with a concept artist, I'm maybe spending half X. I don't know. We're not going into it though it's not like I'm going to save money.
No, you're just saving yourself iteration and headache. I know. Yeah,
exactly.
I actually, there is obviously a lot of questions about the copyright, which I believe is a really very, very valid question. I just don't feel that it's a question that should be solved by public opinion. I think it should be solved by courts.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. What's interesting too is somebody, I mess with AI and whatnot, and I'm a photographer as well. So a friend of mine, I had posted something, and he was like, he's been building kind of like a finding all the images and things like that are being used by Midjourney and these people to train, their engines. And he found that some of my photography was used in this. And he's like, do you know this? I'm like, I mean, no, but, and I prompted it to try to recreate a photo that I've taken. And it was disturbingly very close. It's like, that's interesting. So, I mean, all of it is definitely questionable, even for somebody like me, that my shit's been stolen to train this. But it doesn't negate the value that we have for it as far as using it as a tool. But yes, I agree. It needs to be legally worked out with courts, not...
well, I'm curious. That's actually really cool because I've actually asked a lot of people about different things, and it's really nice to hear that perspective, because I think people need to realize like where the studios are on this. And I think you're right. I mean, I've actually heard, as technology companies are developing AI tools, there's a lot of studios that say thanks, but no thanks, because we just don't want to deal with the the legal ramifications, be it down the road, and we just don't want to risk it, right? And I've heard of certain studios that have stopped updating all of their Adobe products because they cannot risk the copyright issues. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a huge problem, and it is something like I think you're going to, or we're starting to see it in like actor contracts, things like that as well, as far as them trying to push no AI used in anything on the show. Or
I think that's it's hard to judge that,
Exactly.
And I always kind of jokingly say, like, when people say ethically sourced AI, I was like, that's like cage-free eggs. What the hell does that mean?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, we have some ideas, and I'm sure you have ideas as far as like what is ethically sourced AI, and how to actually train, for this. But it's a whole other. I think the one good thing about ethically sourced AI is it gives VFX a job.
Oh yeah,
at least as I see it.
Yeah, I know of. There's a lot of AI training that's being done. Let's say, I don't know, in augmented reality, right? Because they need to augmented reality needs to recognize things in the real world and be able to put those together. And what's interesting about that is that it was cheaper for companies to train it on synthetic data than on real data. So VFX was creating tons of images for training purposes, right? They're not reality. They're just tons of things that represent reality. So they can get through it quicker, right? You need to recognize everything that's in a living room. You create millions of different iterations of a living room. Is much cheaper in CG than it is to build a million living rooms.
Well, especially with photography that you own and all of these other things. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think that there is definitely an opportunity for CG and VFX, at least. How long lasting that is, I don't know. Like, how quickly can you train everything? Like, obviously that takes a while, but certainly people are looking at that.
Interesting. Well, that was a quick little diverge. Tell us a little bit about what you're up to now and like what's going on. What can we look forward to seeing?
Right now I'm taking a break.
Good for you.
I was on the Sympathizer for the last 2 years. And so that was a fun show, but definitely like difficult finishing it out. So now I'm sitting and waiting. I have a project that I'm hopeful for, but we'll see. It's still in the early days.
Are you seeing the industry starting to pick up again in terms of, post strike and stuff?
A little. I think
it's going to be a different industry, don't you think? We're new Hollywood, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, I think there's obviously things are going to pick up, but it does seem somebody posted on LinkedIn, yesterday or 2 days ago, something like that. Although I'm very behind on LinkedIn, so it could have been a month ago for all I know. But it was like credits of a of the last Marvel movie, right? And they were saying like, you know, the year previously there were 2 or 3 Marvel movies published, right? But this year there's only one, right? And just even that downturn in one studio's production obviously has a huge implication. And what they have on their coming up is much less than what, you know, was there previously.
But that's just Marvel. There's other things that are happening.
Then that's just Marvel. And everybody else also is like,
yeah, but I'm starting to see more interesting projects, right? Like you do,
Correct.
And no, you're not going to have the 1,000 VFX artist shows anymore.
Yeah.
But you do have interesting films like Civil War that are coming out. You do have things, you know.
Yeah.
So I think there's just a different change that's going to happen that I think is going to be different. So, and adapting to that world is going to be interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's exactly where, and so I think like MPCs and ILMs of the world that are built around these like mega movies and stuff, like obviously they're going to be affected by that, and like we'll have to adapt, and they always do.
Yeah,
right?
they've done this for 30 years. They've seen lots of changes.
Yes.
40 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, they'll adapt, and everybody else is going to be adapting along with them. But yeah, it's, I think it is turning up though. Like I'm seeing other friends get jobs and people start to come. The unfortunate part though is like, you know, friends of mine who are starting projects right now, we won't turn over plates to vendors till next year. Right. So like I might, like my next project, I think will start in like August. I won't turn over till September of next year, probably after filming and editorial and all of that. So like, that's huge, you know, that's like it's the whole year is just gone. Right.
Even but we also had a lot of stuff, right? Like it was ridiculous. At one point, I think in 2022 or 23, whatever, Netflix was releasing a new movie every week. That was a little crazy.
Yeah.
For one studio.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely excessive.
Yeah, for sure.
Or what I would look at and think is excessive, but what do I know?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it depends on if people are watching it or not, and people were watching it. I think that the interests in films have definitely grown. I just think that people are also a little bit, you know, they do have a little bit of a Marvel fatigue, and that's not to say that Marvel films are bad. It's just there's too many of them.
Yeah. Well, but I think it's left a place for studios like A24, you know, to interject or inject themselves. We saw this
in the 1960s, and then, you know, this is what's happening again, which is great. You know, they just thought, we're going to make Western musicals and, you know, and Doris Day musicals forever. And turns out people were tired of it. Finally, you know, so we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
Well, awesome, Chad. Thank you so much. This has been really insightful. Oh my God, so great to catch up on all our old acquaintances. It's funny. Like now I'm talking to them, I feel like we've talked forever, and this is the first time we've actually met, which is hilarious. So cool. Thanks so much for doing this, and we'll you know, we're looking forward to hearing all the cool projects you're up to.
Yeah, hopefully I will be able to share what's next soon.
All right, and then we'll have you back.
That's right. Yeah.